In the grand narrative of Chinese history, the life of a scholar has often been cast as one of tranquility, refinement, and an ardent pursuit of knowledge. However, the truth, particularly when the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long across the land, was far from the romanticized version. For those who toiled as scholars in ancient China, their nights were not filled with the heady adventures or intellectual debates one might imagine, but instead were marked by a haunting solitude and a haunting sameness. The evening began as it did every day, with the soft glow of an oil lamp or a simple candle placed carefully on a wooden desk. Their rooms, though sometimes graced by the presence of calligraphy or paintings, were mostly austere, the silence broken only by the soft swish of a silk robe or the delicate clink of a teacup. As twilight deepened, the scholar would don his robe, a ritualistic act that separated the day of leisure from the night of study. With the first light of the lamp, he would sit down at his desk, the surface worn smooth by years of use, and begin his task. The flickering candlelight painted dancing shadows on the wall, a silent, slow-moving ballet that mirrored the scholar's own solitude. Most nights were spent poring over ancient texts, the Confucian classics being a particular focus. The scholar would read passages aloud, not for the joy of sound, but to etch the words into his memory. The room was not heated, so as the night wore on, the air grew colder, the breath of winter seeping in through cracks in the walls. The scholar, lost in his books, would shiver, pull his robe tighter, but never stop reading. Outside, the sounds of the night mingled with the scholar's voice, a symphony of crickets, the distant call of an owl, and the soft lapping of water from a nearby well. In the distance, a dog barked, a fleeting moment of sound piercing the scholar's concentration like a tiny shard of glass. He would pause, listen, then return to his book, his eyes straining to make out the words in the fading light. As the hours passed, the candle would burn lower, the flame growing smaller until it was no more than a stub. Its light, once bright and hopeful, now struggled to push back the encroaching darkness. The scholar, oblivious to the passage of time, continued to read, his shadow growing ever larger on the wall as the candle burned down. When the imperial examination was near, the pressure to succeed drove the scholar to burn the midnight oil quite literally. In the final days before the test, sleep became a luxury he could not afford. Each night he would stay up longer, fueled by the hope of a brighter future. His eyes, burning with fatigue, would scan the pages, committing them to memory. The very walls of the room seemed to close in on him, the scholar trapped in his own world of words. The quiet companionship of the night was not always a comfortable one. The scholar was haunted by the ghosts of his ancestors, the great thinkers whose works he studied. He felt their presence in the rustle of the pages, in the shadow they cast on the wall, and in the flickering flame of the candle. They were a constant reminder of the weight of tradition, of the high standards he had to meet. As dawn approached, the scholar would rise, his body aching from hours of sitting, his mind saturated with words. He would stretch, trying to banish the stiffness from his limbs, and pace the room, trying to sharpen his thoughts. Then, with a final glance at the remnants of his candle, he would extinguish the flame and begin his day, carrying with him the burden of centuries of scholarship. The night was over, but its solitude and sameness would linger, a constant companion on his arduous path to knowledge. Although most nights of an ancient Chinese scholar were spent in solitude with books and candles, there were occasions when they gathered with fellow scholars to share words instead of silence. These gatherings usually took place in the stillness of late evening, after the busy noises of the day had faded. The setting was often simple, a wooden table in a courtyard, a few cups of warmed rice wine, and the faint glow of lanterns hanging overhead. The purpose of these meetings was not merriment in the way people might think today. They were slow and deliberate, with each man speaking in turn, often quoting lines of classical poetry or composing verses on the spot. The challenge was not in speed, but in precision. Every word had to carry weight. Every image had to be drawn from memory or imagination with careful balance. Silence between verses was common as each participant thought deeply before speaking. Wine played a role, but it was not consumed in great excess. Small sips were taken, often to loosen the tongue just enough to make the act of reciting poetry easier. The effect was gentle rather than wild. Laughter was quiet, not loud, and conversation moved slowly, like water trickling through a narrow stream. Even when debates arose, they were measured and respectful, revolving around the meaning of old texts or the interpretation of a single phrase. These gatherings rarely stretched into the early hours of dawn. More often, they ended when the oil in the lanterns ran low or when the air grew colder and damp. The scholars would part ways quietly, each returning to his own study or bedchamber. No music played, no dances took place, and no grand feasts were held. The nightlife of these men was limited to such small and subdued meetings, marked more by stillness than by movement. To an outsider, these nights might have seemed uneventful. Yet to the scholars they carried meaning. A single well-written poem exchanged under the dim light of a lantern could be remembered for decades. In a world that valued thought and order, even these modest midnight gatherings became part of the long tradition of scholarly life in ancient China. Now, you might find yourself wondering why a video about ancient China's elite class is being narrated in a style usually reserved for bedtime stories. Well, that's no accident. You see, ancient Chinese scholars weren't just academics. They were also storytellers. To them, a good poem wasn't just an exercise in style, it was a way of capturing the world. A way of understanding the world and a way of sharing that understanding with others. That's why we find these quiet gatherings taking place all over ancient China, in courtyards, along riverbanks, and even in the middle of the desert. They're not just scholars sharing their love of poetry, they're sharing their love of life itself. But why do we tell this story now? Because in a world that's always moving, always changing, it's easy to forget the power of stillness. It's easy to think that in order to connect with others, we need to be constantly surrounded by noise and chaos. But maybe the secret to connection lies in the quiet moments, in the space between words, in the shared experience of sitting still and contemplating the world around us. Maybe that's why stories like this one have endured for so long. They remind us that, even in a world that's always moving, we can find stillness if we're willing to look for it. So, the next time you find yourself surrounded by the busyness of everyday life, take a moment to appreciate the stillness. Take a moment to appreciate the space between words. The silence between notes, the quiet moments that make up our lives. Who knows what treasures you might find. Thank you for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, please don't hesitate to show your support. Your support helps us continue to share these stories and bring them to more people around the world. Until next time, stay curious and keep asking questions. You might think the best way to study ancient Chinese history is through big events and famous people. Think of the times when heroes saved the day, when emperors made big decisions, and when battles decided the fate of nations. You know, the stuff you read about in all those epic historical novels. And yeah, all those stories are true. But there's also something else, a little known secret about ancient Chinese history that most people don't know. After dark, the story goes like this. Not every scholar in ancient China lived quietly alone with his books. Some, especially during unstable dynasties, gathered together in private groups. These were not lively organizations with grand banners or noisy meetings. Instead, they were small circles of men who trusted one another and met discreetly, often under the cover of night. Their purpose was simple, to share ideas that could not always be spoken openly in daylight. Most of these groups focused on philosophy, literature, or moral debates. Some questioned government policies, others discussed interpretations of Confucian texts, while a few allowed whispers about reform or change. Meetings usually took place in the back rooms of tea houses, in secluded courtyards, or in scholars' homes. The atmosphere was always restrained. Voices were kept low, the lanterns dim, and the tone serious. There was no sense of rebellion or riot, but rather a quiet exchange of words that carried weight. The risk, however, was always present. Scholars were expected to remain loyal to the emperor and the established order. To be overheard speaking critically of officials or rulers could end a career before it even began. Punishments for disloyalty could include banishment, imprisonment, or worse. For this reason, these secret societies lived in shadows, their names rarely written down, their members bound by silence. Inside these meetings, long pauses often stretched between sentences. A single statement might be followed by minutes of reflection. The pace was deliberate, as though each word carried a possible consequence. Even the act of drinking tea was slow, as if to measure the distance between thoughts. Many of these groups left no permanent records. Their gatherings dissolved with time, and the memory of them faded as new dynasties rose. To the outside world, the scholars' nightlife appeared quiet and uneventful. But behind closed doors, these small and hidden circles created a world of cautious discussion. Though they rarely changed history directly, they revealed another layer of how scholars lived after sunset, cautious, secretive, and bound by the limits of both loyalty and fear. If you like this kind of historical tale, be sure to check out our other videos. We've got all kinds of stories from ancient China and beyond, just waiting for you to discover them. So why not hit that subscribe button? Join our growing community of history lovers and get a notification every time we release a new video. It's the best way to ensure you never miss an exciting new story. Don't wait. Click that subscribe button right now and let the adventures begin. Now back to our tale. Okay, so you've got these scholars hanging out in secret groups, discussing all kinds of things that are a bit too risky to talk about openly. You've got to admit it's a pretty interesting concept, right? The idea of these ancient intellectuals coming together in the dead of night to share their thoughts and ideas. It's almost like a secret society, isn't it? Well, here's the thing. It's not just a fun historical curiosity. These secret gatherings actually played a pretty significant role in the development of Chinese thought and culture. Yeah, you heard me right. This wasn't just a bunch of scholars having a good time. They were laying the groundwork for some major shifts in the way people thought about the world. Take, for example, the poetry of the Tang Dynasty. Some of the greatest poets in Chinese history came together in these secret groups to share their work and critique each other's writing. It was in these intimate settings that they pushed the boundaries of poetic expression and helped shape the course of Chinese literature. Or consider the impact of these groups on the development of Neo-Confucianism. As scholars gathered together to discuss the classics, they began to develop new interpretations of Confucian teachings that would have a profound impact on Chinese philosophy and society. These secret groups became incubators of new ideas, breeding grounds for the next generation of thinkers and innovators. But it wasn't all just about ideas. These gatherings also provided a sense of community and support for scholars who often found themselves isolated and misunderstood. In a time when intellectual pursuits were often seen as elitist and out of touch, these secret societies provided a space where scholars could connect with like-minded individuals and feel a sense of belonging. It was a rare oasis of intellectual freedom and creativity, a place where ideas could be shared and debated without fear of censorship or persecution. In the dimly lit chambers of old China, where scholars toiled over ancient texts by the soft glow of oil lamps, there existed a realm of quiet desperation. For many, night was not always spent with books and poems or quiet societies. Some nights were filled with secret emotions, a hidden longing that echoed in the stillness. These scholars, often symbols of discipline, loyalty, and restraint, were expected to navigate their lives by a code of conduct that valued decorum, propriety, and unwavering commitment to their studies. Yet beneath this calm exterior, behind the closed doors of their chambers, a different story unfolded. It was a tale of subtle desires and hidden yearnings, a testament to the fact that even the most stoic hearts could harbor secret affections. Their quiet companions were often courtesans, women of grace and charm who had mastered the arts of music, poetry, and conversation. Though society viewed them as lowly, these courtesans were highly sought after by the literati, men who appreciated their wit and cultivated air. Theirs was not a love born out of passion or physical desire, but out of a shared love for the finer things in life, the arts, literature, and the company of an intelligent mind. These meetings, always shrouded in secrecy, took place in the hush of night, far from the prying eyes of the world. In the upper rooms of tea-houses or behind the high walls of private gardens, the scholar and the courtesan would lose themselves in a world of their own. The scholar, usually older and more established, would pore over a new poem he had written, his voice echoing softly in the dimly lit room. The courtesan, trained to appreciate the nuances of poetry, would listen intently, her eyes reflecting the lamplight as she absorbed his words. And when he had finished, she would respond with a song, her voice weaving magic in the still air. Thus, an unusual duet unfolded, a conversation without words spoken aloud, yet volumes exchanged between a man and a woman who shared a love for the arts, but whose lives were kept separate by the rigid rules of society. This tryst, though emotionally charged, was never loud nor demonstrative. It was a subdued affair, a quiet acknowledgment of shared passions and unspoken feelings. As the night deepened, the scholar might share another poem, or the courtesan might offer a dance, her movements as graceful and fluid as the verses he had just recited. They existed in their own little bubble, lost in a world of poetry, song, and dance, far from the expectations of the day. Yet both knew that this nocturnal interlude was fragile, a dewdrop on a leaf, beautiful but transient. The scholar, a man of societal standing, could ill afford the scandal that such a liaison might bring. Whispers could ruin his reputation, jeopardize his career, and shatter the carefully constructed facade of his life. Besides, his primary duty was to his studies. To be distracted by romantic entanglements, however innocent, was not just a breach of decorum, but a betrayal of his calling. For a scholar, to be unblemished by desire was a badge of honor. It showed his devotion to his craft and his ability to master his own heart. As the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, they would part ways, the scholar to return to his books and ink, the courtesan to her own silent chambers. Their tryst a secret buried under layers of propriety and convention. And so their love, if it could be called that, remained unspoken, unexpressed, existing only in the shared glances and the lingering echoes of their art. Some scholars even found quiet attachments in the most unexpected places, in fellow students or companions who shared their passion for learning. These connections, rarely spoken of, were as fragile and fleeting as the cherry blossom, yet no less real for their silence. Their affection was expressed in letters exchanged at night, hidden in the folds of ancient texts, or in long study sessions that stretched from dusk till dawn, their shared purpose a shield against the outside world. Emotions were folded into layers of poetry and metaphors, leaving plenty of room for misinterpretations, for the heart to the imagination what the mind refused to say. These bonds, forged in the crucible of shared ambition and silent understanding, were as real as the scars that marked their studious hands, as genuine as the ink that stained their fingers. They found solace in the companionship, a shoulder to lean on, a mind to ponder with, and a heart to understand. But even these connections were ephemeral, lasting only as long as their shared journey through the world of learning. For once their paths diverged, whether due to a change in fortune, a shift in ambition, or the call of duty, the quiet intimacy they had shared would fade into memory, only to be remembered in the hushed tones of late-night conversations, or in the verses of lonely poets who had loved and lost under the cold gaze of an indifferent moon. And so it was that the scholars of old China, these men who dedicated their lives to the pursuit of knowledge and the contemplation of the world around them, also lived lives of quiet desperation, forever bound to their books, their ink, and their duty. Yet, in the quiet shadows of the night, the hidden side of their hearts beat on, reminding them that even in a world governed by rules and expectations, desire still found a way to exist, quietly like a candle burning low in an empty room. For all their education and refinement, ancient Chinese scholars were not free from superstition. The night, in particular, was seen as a time when spirits wandered, when unseen forces might drift through courtyards, and when silence carried hidden weight. Even a learned man, with shelves of books and years of study, often kept small rituals to protect himself from what he could not explain. It was common for a scholar to place charms near his writing desk. These could be simple slips of red paper with inked symbols, believed to ward off wandering ghosts. Some burned incense before beginning their nightly study, not only for fragrance, but also to create a sense of safety. The rising smoke was thought to carry away bad influences and invite a calmer spirit into the room. The sound of the night could also disturb them. A sudden knock at the window, the cry of an owl, or the howl of stray dogs in the distance were taken as signs that something inauspicious was near. Many paused their work, whispered a prayer, or recited a line from a sacred text to steady themselves. To study at night was not only a challenge of discipline, but also a quiet struggle against the uneasy feeling that one was never fully alone. Dreams, too, carried weight. A scholar who fell asleep at his desk might wake in the middle of the night disturbed by visions. Some believed that dreams revealed warnings from ancestors or signs of failure in examinations yet to come. To prevent this, small offerings of food or wine were sometimes placed at family altars before nightfall, a ritual meant to keep the ancestors pleased and the dreams less troubling. These superstitions rarely interfered with study, but they lingered in the background of every night. The flickering candle flame, the shifting shadows on the wall, and the stillness of empty streets all reminded the scholar of how thin the boundary was between the world of men and the world of spirits. Knowledge might have filled their minds, but superstition quietly shaped their nights. When the long hours of study finally grew too heavy and the candle burned low, scholars often drifted into uneasy sleep. Yet, even in rest, the night was not peaceful. Dreams carried their own weight, and for scholars, they often reflected the burdens of study, ambition, and doubt. Sleep was not an escape, but another space where the mind continued its restless labor. Many dreamed of examinations. The civil service exam was the single most important test of a scholar's life, and failure meant years of work undone. It was not uncommon for a scholar to dream of walking into the exam hall, only to forget every passage he had memorized. Others dreamed of writing endlessly, their brush moving without pause, but the characters on the page blurring until they were unreadable. Such nightmares left the scholar waking with a pounding heart, only to return again to his desk in fear of falling behind. There were also dreams of ancestors and teachers. Some believed that these figures appeared at night to guide or to warn. A kind word from a long-dead ancestor in a dream was taken as a sign of encouragement. A frown or silence, however, could leave the scholar unsettled for days. Dreams, whether pleasant or disturbing, were treated with seriousness, as if they contained hidden messages about the path ahead. Nightmares of spirits were also common. Scholars who studied late often wrote of seeing strange figures in their dream shadows that whispered, or doorways that opened to empty halls. These dreams reflected the mixture of superstition and fatigue that shaped the scholar's nights. Candlelight study strained the eyes, exhaustion blurred thought, and when sleep finally arrived, it brought visions that felt as real as the waking world, yet there were gentler dreams too. A scholar might dream of spring gardens, flowing rivers, or moonlit mountains. These visions, though fleeting, offered a calmness that study rarely gave. They were remembered in poetry, where the line between dream and reality blurred. For scholars, the night was never simple. Awake, they wrestled with books and duty. Asleep, they wandered through dreams and nightmares, still caught in the same cycle of fear, hope, and quiet longing. The nightlife of ancient Chinese scholars may appear quiet, repetitive, and uneventful to the modern mind. Yet across centuries, these hours shaped not only the individual scholar, but also the greater legacy of Chinese literature, philosophy, and social order. Every candle burned late into the night, every brushstroke drawn carefully across paper, and every whispered poem beneath the moon left behind traces that extended far beyond the walls of a small study room. Their nightly routines, though slow and restrained, created foundations of culture that would last for generations. At the heart of this legacy was discipline. Scholars in ancient China were bound to the expectation of study for the imperial examinations, a system that lasted for over 1,000 years. Night after night, countless men sat before their desks memorizing Confucian texts, writing essays, and reciting passages aloud. This constant repetition did not simply prepare them for exams. It established a way of life where learning was seen as an act of devotion. The scholars' candlelit nights became symbols of diligence and endurance, virtues admired and copied by families throughout society. Even those who never passed the examinations carried the memory of their nightly struggles into their homes, teaching children to value perseverance, patience, and respect for knowledge. Another part of their legacy was the poetry created during these quiet hours. Some of China's most memorable verses were composed not in daylight gatherings but in the stillness of night. A scholar unable to sleep might take his brush and write a few lines describing the sound of rain on roof tiles or the loneliness of sitting by a lamp after midnight. These poems, often personal and reflective, captured the intimate side of scholarly life. They revealed how even men of learning felt isolation, longing, and fatigue. Over time, such verses became treasures of Chinese literature, teaching future generations not only about beauty but also about the quiet emotions hidden behind a life of study. The secret societies that formed in dimly lit rooms also left their mark. While most dissolved quietly, some inspired new schools of thought. The act of gathering at night to exchange ideas, even in hushed tones, encouraged debate and diversity of opinion. Although many of these discussions never reached the ears of emperors, they influenced the writings of those who participated. Essays and commentaries born from late-night debates slowly entered the intellectual tradition, ensuring that the scholar's nightlife was not merely passive, but also a space where thought evolved. Forbidden loves and hidden affairs likewise shaped cultural memory. The relationships between scholars and courtesans produced a body of literature filled with longing, secrecy, and poetry. These romances, though often unacknowledged in public life, were immortalized in plays, songs, and written collections. The courtesan, with her music and verse, became a recurring figure in Chinese culture, a reminder that even men devoted to books were also human, with emotions that could not be contained entirely by discipline. In this way, the nightlife of scholars influenced the portrayal of love and art for centuries. Superstitions and dreams also carried their own quiet legacy. The rituals of burning incense, placing charms, and interpreting dreams reveal how scholars lived at the border between reason and belief. They were men of logic, yet they remained sensitive to signs from the unseen. This balance between knowledge and superstition shaped Chinese thought, where philosophy often existed alongside spiritual practice. Even today, traditions of ancestor respect, incense burning, and dream interpretation carry echoes of those long nights when scholars sat nervously under flickering candlelight, listening for sounds in the dark. The dreams and nightmares of scholars may seem like personal experiences, but they too contributed to cultural identity. A nightmare about failure reflected not just one man's fear, but the collective anxiety of an entire system built on examinations. A dream of ancestors revealed the unbroken link between family and education, reminding each scholar that he did not study for himself alone, but also for the honor of his lineage. Over centuries, these ideas reinforced the importance of family duty, respect for tradition, and the pursuit of scholarly success as a path to stability and respect. The legacy of the scholar's nightlife was not limited to intellectual or cultural fields. It also had practical influence on society. Those who succeeded in examinations and entered government carried with them the habits formed in long nights of study. They brought patience, formality, and caution into administration. They were used to silence, to reflection before speaking, and to weighing every word. These habits shaped the bureaucratic culture of imperial China, where officials were expected to be measured, disciplined, and deeply respectful of written order. In this sense, the calm and repetitive nights of young scholars prepared them not only for personal achievement, but also for the roles they would later play in governing the empire. Even failure held its own meaning. The vast majority of scholars never rose to high office, yet their efforts were not wasted. The culture of nightly study spread across society, influencing education at every level. Parents encouraged their children to read under dim light. Villages respected even failed scholars for their dedication, and the image of a man studying through the night became a symbol of virtue. This legacy ensured that education remained central to Chinese life, not just as a path to official success, but as a moral duty. In the end, the nightlife of scholars was not dramatic. It was not filled with noise, luxury, or excitement. It was a life of repetition, of long hours before a candle, of slow conversations, and of quiet fears and hidden hopes. Yet precisely because of this, it built a tradition that valued patience over speed, depth over appearance, and endurance over momentary pleasure. These values carried forward, shaping not only individuals but the cultural fabric of China itself. Today, when one reads an old poem about moonlight, or sees a painting of a scholar seated at his desk beside a lamp, one glimpses the echoes of those nights. They remind us that history is not always written by battles or emperors. Sometimes it is written in the silence of midnight, by a man sitting alone with his thoughts, recording words that would outlast him. The scholar's nightlife may have seemed ordinary, even boring, but its quiet persistence created legacies of knowledge, art, and order that continue to resonate centuries later. In the end, what remains is the image of a single candle, its flame bending slightly in the night air as a tired hand moves across paper. Outside, the streets are silent. Inside, the scholar continues, knowing that even in the stillness of night, his efforts belong not only to himself, but to generations yet to come.